author. It is 8:58 in the AM on December 15th. I'll get that right. Yeah, a Sunday. Now in this video, we're going to be talking about Black Spartans. What are they? And some of the heroes that we never knew. The stuff that you will never be taught in the modern school system. Now, there should be 3 books for personal required reading. The idea of a required reading mechanism usually is for brainwashing purposes. Of course, there's the various reading lists that are out there and different programs to try to get you to go through those, but if you could call this my reading list. And there's basically 3 in relation to true history. These 3, when you read them, allow you to recognize the falsehoods and the reality in any reporting on historical events, anyway. The first is The Levantine Adventure, The Travels and Missions of the Chevalier d'Arvou, 1653 to 1697 by Warren H. Lewis. And this book follows as it states, the travels of a French nobleman and knight named Laurent d'Arvou and his quest to reestablish his family in the Levantine trade. A company, to float a company in the Levant. Now he fails, but with the perspective of being a merchantman and of doing business, the writings of the Laurent d'Arvou, as analyzed in this book from 1963, they paint a picture of the true reality of the region, which affected the world at the time and continues to do so today. But also it gives you a map of the commercial and economic situation of the time period. And also, this entire book just about flies in the face of the modern narrative, the main narrative. This book would be a major problem for the large institutions of brainwashing and liars that we have calling themselves educators today. But it gives you practical understanding, which can in fact be applied to modern and current times. It is not simply a book to be looked at through the lens of something that happened in the past, but rather as an instruction book on how it was done then and where we come from. The next book is called The Iron Kingdom, The Rise and Downfall of Prussia, 1600 to 1947, by Christopher Clark. As the title suggests, this book talks about the Prussian state. However, it lays out some very specifics that contradict the narrative specifically around the so-called Germanic region of Europe and the history of where they came from, as well as a portrait of the individual nation-state empire. Well, it wasn't really an empire, but the entity of Prussia and how they shaped and affected global military capabilities and understanding. And it also, when you read that, you get the idea with which you can compare it to modern propaganda and fraud in historical accounting. The next book, titled Trade and Empire, The British Customs Service in Colonial America, 1600 to 1775, Thomas C. Barrow. gives you a accurate depiction of the Americas of North America during the so-called time period of the colonial era. There's a lot of things contained in these books specifically that allow somebody to comprehend and understand the global mercantile mechanism of the time period, the political state, the foundation for the idea of free people and republics. And it also contrasts strongly to where we are today. These 3 books alone will allow somebody to see through the lies. Now, speaking of books, if you so desire, you may go to buy books from me, written by myself. And with these books, there will be an exclusive certification by the author included in the packaging. And this will show you that while this book was printed by somebody besides myself, the author, it is in its truest form as it can be certified by the author, by the writer of the book itself. I have done my own editing, I've done my own writing, I've done my own cover and artwork. The only third-party mechanism involved is the printer. So you understand that there's no individuals coming in and revising and tweaking little parts to sanitize it. Now you could go and get this exclusive offer at sccolemanauthor, all one word, .bigcartel.com. Say that again, sccolemanauthor, all one word, .bigcartel.com. That's Sierra, Charlie, Oscar, Lima, Echo, Mike, Alpha, November, Alpha, Uniform, Tango, Hotel, that's fun. I just forgot whether or not it was an E or an O. So I'll go ahead and pull it up myself on my phone here. Yeah. Oh, yes, that would be Oscar. So O, R, Romeo, .bigcartel.com. And of course, you can also use the QR code if you so desire. Now, if somebody wants to become an effective paper hunter, essentially, the idea behind this is that you act through paperwork. You become a capable worker with paper. That name, paper hunter, sounds a little bit strange. That's essentially what most attorneys are, the aggressive ones that send summons and demands and other things like that. There's a lot of entities today, especially collection agencies, which act as paper hunters. And every individual can be and have the capability of being a paper hunter. This starts with the necessity for reading and formulating detailed reports. The first thing, if you read detailed reports, then you'll get actionable information. You'll get real good information. The devil's in the details, as they say. Now, if you formulate detailed reports, then you're going to be practiced at actually making the things that other people read and also putting together a document that is taken seriously. That's very important. Now, the next thing you do is you need to build out a list with specifically the identifiable information of the individual. So if a lot of people talk about these watch lists that you're supposed to be afraid of, which has your name and your social security number and things like that on it. Well, whenever you're building out a list of identifiable individuals, you want to include as much identifiable information on that person as possible, or that corporation or company or whoever it may be. Next, you look specifically into the family members and other associates and any other relations to that individual. You're looking to map this person's or this company's social environment. Next, you want to distribute detailed reports, as detailed as you want them to be, of course, and tailored specifically towards the individual or entity that it's being sent to, however it's being sent. And it will list the activities of the target specifically, right? Like you've got this list of different names and identifying information or whatever, and then for those names and that identifying information, you also have the associates and all the people involved, and then to them you detail out the activities of the one you're going after. This is essentially speaking the same tactic used by the enemy and by their institutions. If you step out of line, if you do something against them, they always go after your family and your friends and other people around you. Understanding that they're going to do this. They have no honor, they have no rules, they have none of that. But understanding this is a specific and effective tactic, most people fold when their family or friends get targeted. Well, it's far more effective for individuals across the spectrum to specifically target the associates, the friends, the family, the social environment around their target, what their target's doing. Now, there's a couple ways that this can happen, and it all depends on the information and what's contained in the report given to these individuals. If those people are complicit in whatever activities that might be criminal that you're included in a report, say if that's what this is, then they will go to the individual, inform them that they received this, and then others might do the same thing, and it will cause some activity within the organization. If they don't know, it's likely going to be the same thing. The idea here is to spread a seed of discourse or discord among target this individual through their environment. Implode their life, essentially. If somebody does this to you, there's of course defense mechanisms and things that you can do against it. But the primary thing, the most effective thing you can do is to do it right back. You as an individual, you've only got one family, you've only got one area, sphere of associates. Usually the individuals today that use this have a lot more to lose. And you can target each individual associate singularly and all of their associates. You can completely disrupt their practices, everything. So this is the response to this being used against you. Now, in the book, The British Customs Service in Colonial America, 1600 to 1775 by Thomas C. Barrow, it talks about the particular approach of a individual named Collector Barons. The Collector Barons is one of these heroes you will never know about, but was by far one of, if not the most impactful individual for the not only American independence or the American freedom, the idea of American freedom, the idea of other types of freedom as well, of the Republic, all those things. Well, the collector barons was possibly the most instrumental figure in that scene, that time period. His approach and what he did had far-reaching repercussions. The initial consequences of what he did caused ripples. It made something happen. Okay? You always need a catalyst. Sometimes, yes, you have to build up stuff, and sometimes there's a whole thing for timing, but an individual alone doing the right targeted tactic or program, regardless of when it's done or how it's done. Well, how it's done is a little bit important. They can cause far-reaching consequences. So what Collector Barons did is he's alleged to have been a merchantman in England in the 1600s. He had most of his ships and his livelihood seized in England, and so he decided to go to the Americas, allegedly, to remake his fortune as a revenue collector for the crown. At least that's the official story, as he's reported about. Either way, when he got to the Americas, he collected up all of the information regarding confidential informants, is what they're called today, but essentially speaking, spies who were being paid, had some sort of financial monetary deal or contract, in most cases apparently, with crown collectors and with the collector mechanism and with other people. Well, he took this information and then published it around the area. The initial responses were hatred towards the ones who were selling out their neighbors, or the ones who had made these deals and were talking about this stuff. And a lot of these individuals had to be rescued. A lot of them were hanged, tarred and feathered, stoned, what have you, axed, flayed, etc. Before that, most of the anger and hatred was directed at the revenue collectors. It shifted a little bit specifically to the rats, as it were, the ones who were snitching. But also, whatever was snitched about there had implications not just to the colonists, as some might try to diminish it by saying, oh, it was just an internal dispute. Well, whatever was contained in that information that we don't have access to, of course, they've destroyed it, was not only enough to spur so much hatred and to gain so much anger and seeking of vengeance from the colonists, but it would have had implications for other groups as well, including the French, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, etc. And of course all of the Indian nations and whatnot. Most of them were aware of what was going on. We have a complete false picture of that time period taught in this modern system of lies and dismissiveness and critical thinking and lunatics, basically. Morons and mockers or jesters. So the Collector Barons, he's a truly important figure, and he personally brought on himself a great deal of repercussion for his activities. He returned to England and was, of course, naturally arrested immediately upon arrival. He had his whole life turned upside down. He wasn't allowed to do anything, go anywhere, and he had all of his property and assets seized that he had, I guess you could say, again. But his actions put in motion everything that led up to the war, possibly even the French and Indian War, and of course the War of the Americas, what we might call the Revolution, War for Independence, although those names are inaccurate and inappropriate, and they're designed to twist the truth. But either way, all of the conflict and all of the strife to free humanity, a lot of it had to do with this singular act, which is very flimsy to say was done out of personal greed and interest. Nobody would do this out of personal greed and interest. This is somebody who wants to stick it to the ones that go around dictating and controlling and enslaving people. So this book and what he did gives a haunted picture of the true cabal, which are the ones he specifically caused issue for. The true behind-the-scenes controlling faction. They're the ones that he spurned and got consequences for, but also they're the ones that he was specifically targeting and clearly upset their schemes for now and beyond. So the other thing that this book talks about specifically is the Board of Trade. We have many boards of trade today. There's specifically one in Chicago that's particularly corrupt. But the Board of Trade, residing mainly at Boston, they were particularly hated by the colonists. The Board of Trade is the singular entity that you'll never hear about in the school system because they're being run by the same people, essentially. But the Board of Trade is something that anybody who wants to know about true American history must study. Next, of course, is the faction. The faction you'll find nowhere, but as far as I can tell, the faction are the anti-cabal outfits. And the idea behind what Collector Barons did was it caused a catalyst for a variety of different factions to unify together. And there you find the saying, or the half of the saying, e pluribus unum, which means, and the many united. That is what it means. Is and in both Portuguese and French. It's e in Spanish, right? And Italian and Latin. It's not out of. That's ex, right? Ex is ex officio, is without office. Out, of course, other words could be used for out. Is and. Pluribus is plural, many, and unum is unity, united. They always say out of many one. The out of many one is obviously a false translation because the first letter in that sentence means and. So, and the many united, e pluribus unum, the unification into what the cabal people in England, which were a simple, they were just a simple stepping stone from the Vatican. Well, they called their opposition the faction. Now, the false narrative of the British Empire and English supremacy on the seas comes from one very specific tactic that we see predicated today everywhere. And that's the idea of ship registration. They had a requirement that anybody who wanted to trade in the colonies or with the colonies, or with and in Britain, but mainly in the British colonies, they had to register their ships in England. So naturally, a lot of people would just forge the paperwork. They wouldn't even stop over in England. They would just trade and all that stuff. And they would just be like, okay, yeah, that's a pretty simple fix. That is the singular point. That is the singular explanation for the Great British Empire. It's a fraud, and it's a constantly perpetuated fraud, but either way, it's false. Never happened, didn't exist. It was only because of many people forging documents stating that their ship had been registered in the British Empire when it actually hasn't. It was a formality that was mostly just winked at, and was one of the primary reasons that the people of the colonies rose up unified together, because there were a lot of different rebellions and a lot of different conflicts before the Great War happened, and the British Empire was completely and entirely no longer in name only, but completely obliterated, and then re-emplaced, of course, after in the 1870s. So it was the Board of Trade that was specifically behind the Boston Tea Party. What I mean by that is we're always taught that it was the Great East India Company, another distraction. Great East India Company of the British Empire. Well, the Great East India Company of the British Empire was a subsidiary corporation run and controlled by the members of the Board of Trade. They awarded a monopoly on the tea trade to the East India Company. And that is what provoked the Boston Tea Party, dumping of specifically East India ship tea crates into the harbor. There's a whole lot of lying about that. Also about the name the Sons of Liberty, which was actually taken by the ones who dumped the tea into the harbor, not out of protest. That's one of the biggest things that really needs to be understood. They didn't do it out of protest. They did it specifically to target the profits of a tea awarded monopoly. It was a response to the Board of Trade, but the real issue was not directed at the East India Company. It was directed at the Board of Trade. They're the ones who had to flee Boston Harbor. They're the ones that had to hide in the garrison and eventually flee back to England, allegedly, to avoid being hanged, tarred and feathered, thrown from high place, stoned, whatever you will. So the Board of Trade, they're the ones that did that. They're the ones that were constantly doing nasty things, and they had no regard. They were so arrogant, and they always blamed everyone else for what they caused. I'm sure that sounds familiar for many people. That's how all of our county commissions, city councils, and pretty much everyone in the false government act today. They are so arrogant, and they're so secure in their position. They think they literally can do whatever they want, and nobody's going to stop them or do anything about it. By and large, these Board of Trade members escaped. But not everyone that was involved in these schemes got out unscathed. Either way, that book alone of Trade and Empire cuts through all of the decades upon decades, over 100 years now, of constant lying and fabrication around the history of the Americas that we get everywhere in Google and TV shows, movies, in the school system, all of that brainwashing, all of that work and effort to mystify and to obfuscate what actually happened in the colonial America period from the 1600s to the 1700s. In addition, some things that become very obvious, and that is the red uniform of the British were sent by the Admiralty Court in Boston, and those uniforms are of the Royal Marines. In contrast, the blue and gold is the French naval uniform, the one that apparently George Washington is depicted as wearing. And also, it would be important to note that George Washington, the great figure and all that they lie about constantly, is equally named George as was the king of the time. That's not suspicious. Of course it is. I'm saying that sarcastically. So the other thing to note about the clothing and attire and the uniforms is I traveled to the Mexican city of Puebla, which is the global Jesuit stronghold, if you will, today. When you enter the city of Puebla, there's a huge, enormous, view-dominating glass sign which says Jesuit. It's for some university or whatever. There's a museum in Puebla in which you will find portraits of various Jesuit figures, priests mainly. Of course, the Jesuits are priests in the Holy See, Universal Church, Catholic, Vatican mechanism of control. And in those portraits, which apparently are from the 1600s, you see all the imagery projected onto World War II Germany. All the imagery there. They have the black robes with the white collar and a red background. They have all of the different symbols and whatnot. It looks like a portrait from World War II, the Nazi Reich, as we are taught constantly by the same people that lie about everything else. It is so very clear the contrasting techniques when it comes to lying and public spectacle. Out of the Germans, the Vatican is far more known for public spectacle in those specific three colors of black, white, and red. The first, of course, being the Jesuits in their black frock and white collar. The next, you have the red cardinals, and then you have the white pope. And they have huge public spectacles using those colors. That is where they get the projection onto Nazi fanfare. So very obvious there. Now, one of the main reasons why they would do this is because they constantly use these information campaigns of lying and subterfuge and things like that, and projection and, distracting the masses, all that nonsense. But Prussian generals taught troops around the world. They were hated by the cabal and the globalist people for one very specific reason. Prussian generals brought effective military order to everyone, including the Americas, Africa, India, Asia, all of those places, and it wasn't out of a desire to control those areas, but to give them the tools to free themselves, which is where the Prussian story comes from, and that you will find in the Iron Kingdom book. They themselves came out of being dominated and oppressed by specifically imperial troops of the Holy Roman Empire sent by the Vatican and the alleged Protestant Swedes. They had to form through martial order their own system that could not be broken. And because they did that, they went around and taught this to many other places, many other people. It was very important to have a Prussian general train your army. Our military comes from Prussia. It does not come from Britain. It doesn't even come from the French. It comes from Prussia. Prussia, the Prussian generals wrote military manuals. Their great figure, Frederick the Great, was known for reading detailed reports. That's the standard they went by. The most important thing was not the weapon, but the warrior wielding it. Now, the Constitutional States of America, or CSA, was an ally of France and an enemy of England until after the Civil War. That's because the entity that we call the United States of America is not the Constitutional United States of America, or the U.S. government. That's what we have today. Not the same thing. They've always been a subsidiary of England from inception, and they replaced the original, the true form, the Constitutional States of America. The and many united, not out of many one. So they were an ally of France specifically and not of England, and then that flipped. Well, it didn't flip. The subsequent fraud that came in and stole the image were always allies of England, and by extension of the Vatican, and not of France. Of course, naturally, the Constitutional States of America assisted in the free statement of the city of Tripoli. They assisted, just like the Prussians did, and the American Indians and many other groups, with the movements to free humanity, not restrict them and put them into bonds and chains. The U.S. government did not exist at the time, and the story of the U.S. Marines going in and fighting against Barbary pirates, so-called, in Tripoli is a bold-faced lie. But there is some truth to it, and that is we as Americans at the time were actually there to fight with and for them, given the saber in the Marine Corps as the Mameluke sword, as a memento from an ally. And also the Battle of Austerlitz in Europe happened in the same year. So there's a whole completely different scenario environmentally around the world at the time than what we're taught. Things were so much different from what we believe we know about that time period. So in the book The Iron Kingdom, it talks about the different conflicts happening in Ducal Prussia, the conflict around estate sovereignty we can find today. So basically, the elector had issue with the nobles. The nobles believed that armies, the estates, was their private property. Okay. In this system, there's no recognition of individuals. There's only recognition of the nobility and the main overall sovereign, and the nobility and the sovereign fight each other. And that's what's happening here, and that's what's happening in other parts of Europe. The difference being that in Prussia, there was a unified identity around all of the people in Prussia, and kicked out the self-serving nobles that nobody wanted around anyway, causing all these problems, fighting each other, and then siding with the ones that went in and ravaged and raped the country. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? So, in France, a different scenario was happening than what we're taught. The superiority, the superior control of the French crown is false. The majesty of Louis XIV. At the time period, there were actually a lot of different actors together, and one could not simply say somebody was French and assume they were an automatic subject to the French crown. They weren't. There was a shared French identity that people carried with them, and they were antagonistic to the crown of France, an enemy of it, because they understood that the crown of France was owned by the Vatican, not doing things out of benefit of the French people, but rather the Pope over there and all of the other corrupt globalists that work together today. Many of these actors were guilds, trade guilds, and there were cities themselves, right? Like, it wasn't always that because they were contrary to the French crown, that they were good, because the Parisian control ruling structure, which actively participated in campaigns against the French crown specifically, they could not be unseated. They were stable in their position. And they weren't the only ones. The Marseille ship owners controlled a monopoly, and they essentially dictated and ruled over their domain with absolute power. And you had all these different groups here and there, all fighting each other, all doing whatever they wanted, and they did not adhere to the French crown, and it was the same everywhere. So this idea that we're taught in school system that's false, of the supremacy of the royal monarchs, is just not true. Also, the trade of the French, not the French Empire and not the French crown, but the trade of the French, constantly obfuscated by false historians today, they had far more reach when it came to trade than anyone else. Not only did the French trade in Canada and Louisiana, not again as a crown territory. That can't be reiterated enough because of the amount of lying about Canada being a French territory and Louisiana being a French territory. They were not French territories. Instead, you could think of them more as an area that had a lot of Frenchmen in it, in which the crown claimed the region as their territory with no other explanation than there were Frenchmen there, and those Frenchmen that lived there despised the French crown. And it was the same with North Africa and many other parts, Asia as well. But they, by and large, had far more influence everywhere, and the French enjoyed a almost exclusive control over the Levantine trade. There were other people involved there and whatnot, other groups and whatnot, but at the time period there was a division based off of your nationality, just like there is today. But through the period of breaking away from that domination structure, there was a breakdown in the rigid lines of national identity that we see today. They re-emplaced that over time. Now, the other thing that's very important to notice about history, the glaring elephant in the room, is the fact that Rome, or the Vatican, the Universal Church, the globalists, whatever you want to call them, erased significance of acts against children in history. We all know there were a lot of heinous acts and bad things done to children. And it's no wonder why a globalist-controlled structure of brainwashing does not want there to be any mention of horrendous acts against children, because they're the ones perpetuating it. So we'll talk about some of those. Game of Thrones specifically got cut off and derailed and crashed and whatnot when they started talking about heinous acts done against children. There's been a lot of heinous acts done against children, and there's so much effort to suppress, remove, and destroy any mention of it, erase it all. Why is it that only recently we start hearing about expansive operations of pedophilia in the Vatican and Catholic churches, or all the other churches? Really, they're all the same. You know, they all have pedophilia. The teachers unions, the Epstein and Maxwell and all of those different things, right? There's just so much pedophilia. Now, it's not just an anomaly that popped up. It's been going on for a long time, but every mention, every documentation, everything that talks about it was specifically targeted and erased, and the ones who were complicit in that are just as evil, even though they may not have been directly involved in those types of operations. The idea of erasing mention for whatever reason is aiding and abetting, giving aid and comfort to them. So one of the examples is in French 1600s. The Madame de Maintenon, or the apparent false secret wife of Louis XIV, I don't believe that, ran a convent in which she specifically talked about making sure that the girls took quinine. That's something that they use to invoke the PTSD symptoms in military veterans, specific combat, giving them different forms of quinine. So there's that one. Next, in the Iron Kingdom, it mentions the Swedes hanging children naked or leaving them out to freeze. And that's not even close to the only horrendous act that we're never going to be taught about in the modern system that protects people like this. Individuals and groups that do these things are protected. That's very important. The Imperials roasted people, and this one's a little explicit, shoved pieces of wood into the penis and down throats mixed with water, feces, and salt. And the Swedes cut off people's calves to keep them from running away. Now, the reason why I'm specifically stating that the Swedes cut off the calves, hung children naked, and left them out in the cold is because the other things that were done by the Imperials. So the Swedes apparently are the Protestants fighting the Imperials, and it's obviously two sides of the same coin. Now, another major distinction between then and now are schools. Prussian schools contrast strongly to the modern one because the Prussian schools not only celebrated and taught the use of firearms, but heavy artillery. Every single thing, they treated the people in the region as needing to be trained in the discipline and martial valor to defend themselves, their neighbors, their countrymen. And that, of course, contrasts today where it's all completely prohibited. The conceptual understanding behind the absolute, complete prohibition in modern schools of self-defense versus the Prussian idea of ingraining order and capability tells you exactly what the purpose is there. The Prussian purpose is to protect the people themselves. Protect the people. The purpose here is to weaken the people and make them easy targets by an enemy institution. The school system is an enemy institution. They prohibit guns across the board, and the people that are associated with that are traitors engaging in treason, and they're enemies. They are doing that specifically to make sure that you and your children are easy targets. That's the big difference. And that's the thing the globalists hate so much about the Prussians. They went around teaching you that if you want, as it says in the Second Amendment, the security of a free state, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Any excuse to infringe on it is coming from an enemy outfit desiring to, as I said before, hang children naked and leave them to freeze in the cold, roast people in order to get their valuables and money from them. Those what the imperial soldiers did, Saxons and Swiss and Spanish tercios, and also the so-called German Black Riders, which is actually where the black uniform of the so-called Nazi SS comes from. But either way, those are the things they want to do to you and your children. And they will do it again. They've done it before. They've simply erased the mentions of it. But it has happened. And it's logical, too. We see the things happening today. They can't suppress everything. So, martial capability is very important to self-defense. Ours prohibits firearms, and thus we have no martial capability, and people are all a bunch of scared cowards that just go around letting people do nasty stuff to them, steal their children, impoverish them, and everything else. That is by design. So because the Prussian state did this, because they understood that the primary thing you need to have in a school system is in training, self-defense, and martial valor, standing, and capability, orderly capability where somebody has to respect you, practically. If they don't respect you, then they will pay for it. That is the important point there. And so that's what they taught the school system, and that is what was taught around the world. And the idea of martial order, of attention to detail, reading detailed reports and writing detailed reports, all of those things were trained from a young age. They were instilled in that particular entity that became so powerful and such an example to the world. And that is the only reason why such a thing as the alleged American War for Independence even took place. Practically speaking, they wouldn't have had the capabilities to do that if they didn't have Prussian generals to go there and train them how to do that stuff. And that's where our modern Marine Corps comes from. It's from the Prussian military order. And unfortunately, Marines aren't taught that until they've become 17 or 18. And it's it's not just a disservice, it's treason. What they're doing is treason. It's setting everyone up to have this horrific and horrendous activities done to us, actually. Now, the other thing that they understood, besides the importance of arms and professionalism, was the aftercare of warriors, officers, veterans, front linemen, whoever it was. Whoever controls the aftercare, pensions, all of that stuff, ensures the loyalty and care for, it ensures that those people will stay loyal. They will not go off joining these imperial mercenary forces, going through lands and roasting people alive until they told them where they had hidden their gold or silver or whatever. They wouldn't do that because they knew that even if they died, or if they didn't die, if they got wounded, they were cared for. The individuals, the private institutions that control the aftercare of veterans today are foreign, and we all know that the GI Bill and all other benefits in the Marine Corps and the military at large is a joke. They don't assist you. They put a leash on you, and if you don't toe the line, then they yank it out and they steal all of that stuff they promised to you, which is barely enough to survive on anyway. So we all know that. They constantly brainwash regular people, but then a veteran comes in and says, I don't care what they told you or what you've seen on TV or in movies or on the false news. I know personally from my own experience about this. You cannot tell me otherwise because I've lived through it. I've experienced all this stuff. I had people in the entire mechanized system of the education department and the so-called fake law enforcement. All of them were behind the thieving of my education benefits because I had deigned to publish the crimes they were doing in the school system. That is the key point that you would understand there when it comes to what the importance of aftercare really relates to. I don't believe anyone in the military or who has ever been in the military trusts the aftercare system, and that is the whole point. It is not controlled by the military. It's not controlled by any of us. It's controlled by our enemies, no less. That is amazing. That they've managed to acquire that capability, the ability to hold the pensions and to hold the safety and security of our armed forces is held by foreign enemies. It's very weird. So, and then, of course, the other thing that you need to think about is which groups actively, in the open, so blatantly and obviously, suppress incidents of child rape, protect pedophiles, and they treat the people and children as jokes. Who does that? Well, the health department, the developmental disabilities, job and family services, child protective services, school administration, teachers, clergy, and all of the other usual culprits. When you go to them, they treat you like a joke. You go to the clergy about it, they talk to you like your child. You talk to teachers, and they whine and complain and talk about how victimized they are when they do nasty things to the children in their so-called custody. You go and talk to them and they treat you like you're an enemy, hostile, right? All the teachers, all the basic level, all of them, right? Some of them might try to sympathize with you, but they lie and they treat you like a joke. You go up to them with particular information of what they're doing, they laugh in your face. These people have no issue hanging children naked and leaving them out to freeze. The Vatican, that was behind the imperial forces that did it at the time, is still behind the modern school system today that is run by these people who steal children and run such schemes as the cash for a child one of the person who is apparently exonerated by the false Biden character, which I don't believe that happened, but it is, of course, bringing attention to the extensive amount of focus by enemy elements on children. As far as I'm concerned, everyone that works in the school system is a traitor. They're not just traitors, they are sick, disgusting individuals who would rather go around, and they're complete narcissists, talking about how they're victimized while they go around and abuse children. They don't have any issue hanging children at all. They're just the greatest level of evil. And you find that when you go to the health department or when you go to the job and family services or child protective services, you sense, you feel the evil there weighs on your shoulders. And when you go and talk to the blue-haired, wicked, woke, lesbian, crazy person at the front desk, they look at you and they deny everything and they act like you're crazy. Right? Just like, and the people at the border, right? You know, when I went to the border and they asked them about where my daughter was when they were holding my daughter, and they acted like they didn't know what I was talking about. I've done videos on those types of experiences. These individuals know what they're doing. And you think about what elements actually actively suppress stories of child rape and things like that. That whole stuff about taking down child pornography, right, that the woke people talk about censoring that stuff or whatnot, they're not actually concerned with that. What they're concerned with is censoring people referring to or talking about these child trafficking schemes. These people are absolute evil, and they have done these nasty things. These groups, these organizations historically, which are still around, strangely enough, and haven't been completely gutted and destroyed and obliterated, although the Vatican was invaded and burned a lot of times, but who knows how much of any of that's true. Either way, in those past periods, all of the same destabilization tactics were present. It's an old tactic that's been repeated many, many times. It's the idea that the dead tell no tales. You kill everyone in the region and then you resettle it. This is exactly what is depicted in the Iron Kingdom. The only reason why any of this stuff is known about what happened in the old region of Ducal Prussia is because it was written down by somebody. Clearly not illiterate, as we're taught. That person wrote down what had happened there, and of course the liars would come around and say, well, that's a forgery. And then they, of course, wait until you've died, and then they would erase all mention of it. That's what they always do. And then they resettle with other people who have no idea that the same things that happen to the people that live there is going to happen to them. But as many people say, the land remembers. So the other idea is that the pillars of a state is in trade and navigation. And so the main things that the Board of Trade passed, which the colonists hated to just, you have to imagine they had almost 200 years of constantly being subjected to nonsense, to criminal edicts and acts where these people got away with whatever the hell they wanted. And the primary one of those were the acts of trade. Eventually, finally, people said, enough, you're going to die. And of course, we're eventually going to have to do that again today. And yes, all the censorship activities and all the work is specifically against that, as it was then and still is today. That, of course, you know, it's the primary tactic, the primary operation is all around psychological tactics and lying. And we all know who's doing it. The Job and Family Services, specifically, they make their business out of poverty. They act to impoverish you. They have monetary incentives to impoverish the places they're in. That's very important. They're not there to help you. They're there to make you poor. So you have to come to them and sign over your soul for scraps that they stole from you, designing to make you impoverished. They're not the only ones, of course, but that entity itself, Job and Family Services, is built and designed to impoverish. Child Protective Service is designed to remove children from the impoverished families after the Job and Family Services have impoverished them. Juvenile detention centers are then used against the non-compliant children. And developmental disabilities are designed to rescue the ones that perpetuate such an evil system. They always come in and talk about how this person is mentally incapable, just as we saw with the Ghislaine Maxwell case of all the heinous crimes they did. No, they're actually fully mentally capable, and the Department of Developmental Disabilities is specifically designed to protect child traffickers, pedophiles, and the people that would have no trouble in hanging your children. Then dog kennels will act as secondary detention facility. As I stipulated in my last video, they have charged the Humane Society, the ones that keep the dog and cat kennels, to take children from people's homes. Now, the other thing we need to talk about is the similarity of imagery and use in psychological warfare, which was allegedly leveraged by the Waffen-SS and compares very strongly to the way the U.S. Marine Corps operates. On the other hand, the same way they mock the Waffen-SS with characterizations and imagery, and of course the so-called Nazi Reich, National Socialists, is the same caricature and the exact, almost down to the T, same tactic used against the CSA, or Constitutional States of America, what they call the Confederacy, and is currently today being leveraged against the U.S. Marine Corps. It's the neo-Nazi cartoon character of a roided out crackhead, face tattoos, and whatnot. That is a cartoon character that so strongly contrasts to the professional in his dress uniform attire, going around and executing effective, well-planned, thought-out, and practiced intelligence operations and martial operations. And then you've got the neo-Nazi, which is just a characterization to mock them. Same thing with the so-called Confederacy. They constantly have the mocking image. And in the Marine Corps, they have these stupid sayings like the gayest Marine is a married Marine. They have all these things about Marines being gay, unprofessional. And then, obviously, Marine veterans are all just a bunch of drug-dealing thugs that do whatever. right? They depict this stuff. So, it's not going to be a long before we have depictions about the U.S. Marine Corps that are done in the exact same way as the neo-Nazi cartoon character and the Confederate rebel cartoon character. However, when it comes to the Marine Corps and the Waffen-SS, the use of threatening imagery, the devil dog, right? You've got the sea wolf of the so-called Nazis. They're not Nazis, but the Prussian military order. You have a lot of similar relativity. You've got the bulldog of the Marine Corps, right? We've got a hard charger. We've got all these different terms that revolve around the bull, around the bison, around the stag, and around the dog. Whereas the Prussians had a lot of theirs developed around the wolf, around the stag, around different groups. And of course there's the Winterfeld area, and that relates to the Game of Thrones with the wolf symbolism for the Starks. Well, there'll always be a Stark at Winterfell. And the other thing is, when we look at Neo from the Matrix, you notice that word there, right? Neo-Nazi and then Neo from the Matrix. Neo-Nazis are evil villains that are constantly characterized by liars, jesters, and other contemptuous people who are trying to constantly project their own contemptuous state onto other people and other groups. And then Neo from the Matrix obviously was a professional, at least in the first movie, who joined the resistance and was the hero. Now, the other thing that's interesting about this is they all wear black. The Marine Corps wears the black coat on our dress blues. The Waffen-SS wore the black uniform. Neo, from the first movie anyway, wore the black suit. Then, in the second movie, he was adorned with the Jesuit frock, black with the white collar. The other people that wear black is the Eastern Orthodox, the Ashkenazi Jews. Actually, pretty much all the Jews wear the black. The John Wick, played by Keanu Reeves, who also plays Neo in The Matrix, ironically, wears the black suit in the first movie. The other two are, just like with The Matrix, complete crap. But he's a member of, apparently, the assassin for the Russian mafia. So there's a ubiquitous use of the wearing of black on the Cabal side and on their opposition. It's very interesting. Next, the SS intelligence, the Waffen-SS, the Prussian military intelligence apparatus, was extremely effective at weeding out and targeting specifically agents of the globalist cabal. Then they mix some of their own tactics, such as the fanfare of the Vatican and things like that, and then they lump it on there and they mix that into their reporting. Well, if you understand that you're dealing with a professional military intelligence outfit, you can pull out all the relevant details and discard the irrelevant ones. The idea of the precise professionals, the first thing you want to do is you want to get your target. You don't want to just willy-nilly blanket things, go around doing stuff like mass punishment, stuff like that. That's done by cabal. That's done by people who have no regard for the consequences of what they're doing in the area. But if you're a practiced professional, then what you want to do is get the job done. You don't want to waste your time doing anything else. So the first thing they do is identify the cover identities. And one way you do that is by combing with a fine-tooth comb through people's ancestry. They always report this as they were looking for relations to Jews. Well, Judaism is a religion that can be adopted by anyone. There's no such thing as an ethnic Jew. However, if you run a background check on somebody when they're trying to get a clearance, you go around and talk to their family members and you dig through their family history. You're looking for anomalies. And the reason why the cabal wants to vilify such an activity is because their cover identities usually don't go back very far. And that's a way you can identify somebody who's likely a cabal agent. Of course, if you're a professional, you don't just use one thing, you try to corroborate everything together to accurately and correctly identify that you have your target. Also, the other thing to notice is the ubiquitous use, especially when you look at Inglourious Bastards, the movie, of alleged Jews running from the Nazis, from the Waffen-SS specifically, the Prussians, hiding in subterranean structures and places in the wall, things that were specifically built there before to abscond and to hide them. Obviously, if you aid and abet a traitor, then you're also guilty of treason. But the other thing about it is that this imagery strongly relates to the Underground Railroad, which is equally taught unquestionably as a good thing, and then relates in addition to what I did in that instantly censored video of the activities in Texas, where a Spanish railroad company is awarded the main contract to work on the Texas highways. That's not suspicious at all. The imagery, the use of underground subterranean structures, the Underground Railroad, all of that adds up when you understand that these individuals have an extensive network of child trafficking operations and other types of warfare operations, moving of equipment, of weapons, of everything. They are in full comprehension of the traitorous operations they're conducting. And most of it's built around brainwashing. And the primary one, of course, is around the use of effective military intelligence tactics to identify their cover identities. That's something they're very afraid of. Now, there's a TV series called Night Sky, which was canceled because it was obviously teaching too much that's close to reality, just like with the Game of Thrones. And in the TV show, there were these portals that you could instantly travel from one place to another. They were all subterranean. One was under a church. The other one was on a shed behind an old couple's house. They went to different planets and whatnot. And then you had these groups of people who wanted to control these portals and keep them secret. And they referred to anyone that they targeted who had been part of their group but left as apostates. The Apostolic See is the term that the Vatican uses to reference its global property of the Universal Church and all that nonsense. Now, as it relates to that video I made about the Spanish railway company running the Texas highways, well, I got the jump on that because that was about the issue with the banditos. And so my video got a whole bunch of views for a short period, and then it was specifically removed from the search engine. You could no longer search it. It didn't appear in the search bar. Instead, you got these shills, these paid operative talking heads, arguing back and forth about it being a feud or being not about a feud, but essentially they just bombarded this topic with a whole bunch of false information that had absolutely nothing to do with what was actually going on there. And they removed from the ability to search it the video that I had done. That is their primary tactic on how they bury and suppress things. Now, the next thing about this idea of blatant treason is a document talking about the JROTC sending the wrong message about weapons and violence. I'm sure we've heard that slogan a lot in many different forms, but now they're specifically and so blatantly targeting the martial strength of our armed forces. They are fully aware this is treason. They think nothing's going to happen to them because they revised the U.S. Constitution. But these people want to instigate the situation in which children get hanged naked in the cold. The Armed Forces in our high schools is the title. It's got multiple titles, right? Talks about banning military rifle training in schools and eliminating references in books. The reasons for this is, one, JROTC teaches marksmanship. You would expect that from a group that's legitimately built around the idea of training up members of the future members of the military, right? Students carry weapons or facsimiles in JROTC drills, and JROTC textbooks show weapons and how to use them. They want to completely remove even the mention of weapons and how to use them. Students are taught that conflicts can be resolved by the use of force. Well, here's a question. What exactly is the point of a school resource officer? What is the point of the police force, the sheriffs, or any of these other groups, or protective services? To teach that conflicts can be resolved by the use of force. Of course, they're not saying that it's a bad thing that students are taught that force can be used to solve conflict or can be used to resolve conflict when it comes to their operatives, only when it comes to those sworn to defend the Constitution and the ones who are likely to protect the people in the region. That is so blatantly obvious, right? JROTC has collaborated with the Pro-Gun National Rifle Association and the Civilian Marksmanship Program. Usually when you accuse someone of being a collaborator, you're calling them an enemy. They know that they're traitors, right? These people are traitors. Students not in JROTC caught with saber, rifle, or even toy gun would be expelled and arrested, which ironically is the use of force to solve a conflict. But the most important thing to understand here is this is being done against children. And you think these people have no issue hanging children naked? They did it before, they're going to do it again. And these documents are tangible evidence that they are planning it. Next, we've got the Memorandum of Understanding from 2018 between the Fairfield County Auditor's Office, Office of Information Technology, and the Multi-County Juvenile Detention Center. It specifies the use of Uniflow and adequate server space for jail management software and file sharing. The Cisco UCS hardware. There's no applicable licensing of device and user cost given to all county departments, so they don't have to pay the same stuff that everybody else does for managing copiers and printing and accounting. So that's, where the information is stored, fortunately, from that document. It doesn't teach much else, but it is interesting how these things correlate to the Cash for Kids scheme that is currently in the news today. And there's a lot more that will be exposed, but the important thing to know about it is that something definitely, absolutely needs to be done, and we need to restore essentially the specific martial elements that they denigrate because their life depends on it. Thank you.